So
Great. I'm on it.
thank you. So we're here today to talk about experiential learning, and it is absolutely one of my very favorite topics. Um, and what I'd like to do is start with, I guess, an insight, because after all, this is expert insights, right? Here's the insight. I don't think this is going to be earth-shattering to many people. The insight is that experience is the best teacher. The idea being that giving people the experiences that they need to be successful, that is, putting them in situations, presenting them with opportunities and challenges, and letting them learn without fear of consequence. That when we can do this, whether it be for a quick icebreaker that you want to do in the middle of a remote learning event or an in-person offsite, or whether it be a workshop for a half day or a full day or 5 days, or maybe a cohort that's going through a whole course or a professional development type thing, where regardless, that when people have an experience, they learn from it. And so this idea took root with me many years back, and I started to really think through it. And I'm going to tell you two stories about how I came to think this, and I promise it will come to fruition when we go through the science behind it. So if this is my first foray into understanding that experience is a good teacher. Way back when I went through the project management professional certification, and I'm sure it's gotten better over the years. This is not a diss to PMI or anything, but we literally went into a lecture hall and a different person took every section of the PMBOK and they lectured at us. And this literally is what the room looked like. It isn't a picture. This is a stock photo, but it could have been. For us, many of us were working adults, and we came into this at the end of the night, and these concepts were technical and they were intricate, and we just listened and listened and listened, slide after slide after slide. So what was really happening was I thought we were going to get the expert at the front of the room's insights. Not at all. They were literally regurgitating every single chapter of the PMBOK. Um, so it became sort of a necessary evil. And I went to it, I finished the classes, but realized that they were going to do nothing to help me be a better project manager. And I had a really big leap from what I heard and what I read into my actual life running projects. And I thought that is the worst training in the world. I would never go through that again. Now, granted, they were trying to get me to pass the test, so that's fine. Okay. Maybe they weren't there to make me a better project manager. They were there to help me pass the test. I can get that. But this is when it started to occur to me that what was lacking was context. Every once in a while, one of the instructors would throw in a story, but it was sort of at their whim, and it was what they thought. And sometimes it connected, many times it didn't. Sometimes it helped, lots of times it didn't, but there was very little for me to grab onto. So no experience whatsoever. So that was a very early learning for me. Some years later, I was working on a large project, running a large project, and they were doing something called implementing something called Lean Six Sigma. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. It is a process improvement methodology that that a lot of organizations still to this day practice. But we were implementing this in a big company, and we really needed people to be good at applying all of the concepts and running projects for improvement. And I was dismayed when I went into the room and realized that it was more of what I'd seen in the PMP certification. But the difference is here, people had to perform on the job. And so there was someone at the front of the room. It was 4 weeks, 5 days a week, 4 different times during the year. And these experts got up in front, and we're talking technical tools, plus soft skill tools, all rolled together. And the idea was you left here and you were going to actually be critiqued on how well you implemented these things. And what I noticed around the room was just tons of frustration. And that was when it sparked to me. I was at that time working on my master's degree in organizational development and change leadership. And I realized we can't teach this way. We can't develop skill this way. And so I set about writing a simulation so that we could actually run the people in the room through a storyline that would give them an idea of what they were about to encounter. And that rather than lecture at them, let's let them work through it together. And it was a ton of work. But what I realized was once we had it all together, it was quite a production to facilitate and execute. But what happened was we didn't have to teach as much. We did a lot less teaching, and there was a lot more learning going on. And in fact, the learning cycles were distributed through the people going through the experience. They were help teaching each other because they all had different experiences. And so that is where I kind of came to this, that that's the best way to develop. Now, of course, this is not something this is not just something that I came up with, obviously. In fact, I've got a couple great quotes here from this one by Mark Twain is really appropriate for the first picture I showed you. Now, lectures are ways of transferring the instructor's lecture notes, to the students' notebooks without passing through the brains of either. I think that's just brilliant. And of course, Albert Einstein is the one we always hear quoted, saying learning is experience, everything else is just information. And so this was this idea that I had, and what I ended up spending a lot of time talking to people about. And Beth and I have had amazing conversations about this, that if we can bring experience into learning, that we actually have a chance for people to develop. So that's the insight that I really wanted to talk with you about today during our time together. So the punchline is less teaching, less telling, more collaborating, and more doing. And of course, when people are collaborating and doing, they're what? They're really engaged. And we're not talking engagement as in let's throw some polls at them and a few emojis and have them raise their hand. We're talking engagement as in I am a person who's engaged with what I'm doing. I'm in it heart, mind, and soul. So I'm learning it at a depth in my being that is going to allow that path to application to be really, really obvious to me. And so that is the insight that I wanted to talk to you about. Now I wanted to point out that again, this is not just Christine, right? There's a gentleman, his name is Albert Bandura. He is what people call the father of social cognitive theory. And social cognitive theory is, you cannot boil that down, right, into one slide. But what I really got from him when I studied him, the reason he spoke to me is he talked about this idea of self-efficacy. And that was really what I was in search of when I created that Lean Six Sigma simulation, was the idea that that we would actually do it. And what I saw happen in front of me, and now I've been watching this for years, is that as people actually succeed, it builds their belief that they can succeed. And this is not just mere self-confidence, like, I think I can do it. It's more than that. It's, I know I can do it. And Bandura talks about how that idea of self-efficacy is the single most important ingredient that helps us see if someone's really going to change their behavior. And he boils it down to being really affected by two big things. First is what he calls master or mastery experiences. And this is the kind of experience where somebody is doing something. They're getting real feedback. Maybe they fail, but eventually they succeed. And the thing they're doing doesn't even have to be the exact same thing we want them to learn. It has to be close. It has to be one of those things, for example, if I'm a rock climber and I say, well, I've climbed that rock before and I've climbed that rock before, and that one's a little taller and it looks a little more treacherous, but I know that I know I can do that because I've done these. So it's that kind of an experience we can draw on that gives us this portion of self-efficacy, which says, hey, I can do this. It's a belief. And the second part Bandura talks about is vicarious experiences. And this is incredibly powerful. And I have really had fun myself tuning into this. A vicarious experience is where somebody who's roughly the same as us, and by a model, and what I mean by that is in whatever way they need to be like us. Maybe it is a colleague who has the same reporting structure, or maybe it is a character that isn't even real, but they have the same setting and the same kind of experience that we have. And we watch them, or we witness them, or we experience them being successful. And it becomes well, if they can do it, I think I can do it too. And what's really interesting is vicarious experiences are almost as big as they're almost as strong as mastery experiences. And Bandura talks quite a lot about that. And I have found that to be true, that the vicarious experiences we have are just as important. And there are other theories, and I'm sure some of you know them, because we got probably a lot of people on here that are seasoned educators. And so you know this to be true, I'm sure, and could probably add a lot to it. But this power of experience is what kind of drew me into this topic of experiential learning. To take it one step further, the guy that we saw that was so frustrated in my Lean Six Sigma lecture example, this is where we go. We go from being really concerned that we can't do something and to watch people be really pumped that they get it and I can go do it. And that transformation is where I think the power of experience and experiential learning, that us and our people can get that from a really powerful experience. So I'm going to put this now into terms that probably all of us already know, right? The things that I'm talking about here probably are not new concepts to you. I'm just trying to get them pointed out. And we know that engagement is how adults learn. And for some of you out there, most of us are probably studies of adult education. So we look at the andragogy model, but honestly, it's the same for children. They need to be engaged as well. So when we talk about being engaged and having an experience, what are the things we're talking about? So what goes into that? Well, the first part is about being active. And those of you who are into learning science will know that that is called active learning, right? You can go research that. And that is about learning by doing and getting feedback. That feedback doesn't have to be only from an expert. It can be from colleagues. It can be from people you're having a vicarious experience with. It can be from an expert. But getting feedback, and it can just be from our own performance. We tried something, it was really hard, we didn't do well at it. But that idea of getting feedback and getting it pretty quick, and being able to iterate through that to raise the learning cycles is a key part of the way that people learn. Secondly, is learning with peers or just learning with other people. This idea of collaborating, and contributing my own experience and me listening to your experience and us discussing and debating and having maybe even being under pressure to produce something, by having to present, by having to decide. These are all the kinds of things that get at critical thinking. And when we're having to do those things and produce something by being active, we're getting to a level of engagement where real development happens. Now, if we take that and we say, all right, so we're being active, we're collaborating, right? Where our head is, not just our head, but our heart and minds are in it as well. Now, if we do that while being immersed, so involved in and interacting with a story or a scenario or a situation, I'm sure many of you have been involved in really good case studies before. And sometimes case studies are really awesome, but they have a limit because, we're just reading them. But still, a case study can draw us in and bring us down into a level of learning that's deeper because we're in a particular situation and we have to respond to that situation. Now it's not just an exercise that we know is going to come and go in a moment. We're really into the storyline. The power of story, which I could do a whole nother thing on, is quite something. And to be able to pull people into a story and have them interact with it gives us a really deep level of engagement. Now, the last part of engagement is having it be in context. I've seen some really good simulations out there that are they're canned simulations and they're good. Like, for example, learn about leadership by taking a trip to Mars. That's great and all, but now you have to make sure there's somebody around to help you make the leap from what you just learned about leadership going to Mars and now leadership in my organization or in the context that I work in. And so this idea of being in context, um, there's a fine line, right? If it's out of context, we have to do a lot of square peg and round hole conversations and a lot of really uh, good facilitator debriefs. But if you turn the volume up all the way on being in context, if it's exactly like our job, now it's almost a little too close. Now we start to get hung up on little things like, oh, no, that isn't really how that works, or yeah, that would never happen. So we got to be somewhere in between there, more towards being in context, but not so close that it interferes with the person's actual reality. So here is how when I think about true engagement. And what I set out to do those years ago when I worked on that simulation was recreating these things, bringing these things in so that we could get people to a really deep level of learning. Because we know that the deeper the engagement, it drives understanding and development and change. And that is what we're talking about here. We talk about experiential learning. And I think you can pull this off in varying degrees. You don't have to have a complete dive in. You can use these kind of concepts to produce a very short learning event that's part of something you're doing with your team. But I do think that when you get to the deeper, longer courses or the workshops, you can really draw people in. And now the path to application of those skills is really clear. And that's kind of the beauty of it. So what makes an experience really? And this was kind of the punchline, right? People immersed in a believable, recognizable environment, working collaboratively through challenges. When that happens, they tap into these levels of learning that drive understanding, application, and change. They don't merely glimpse a concept or grasp it, they grok it. And if that reference doesn't make sense to people, it's my new favorite word. It is a word. Go and look it up. If anybody does know what it is and wants to put something in the Q&A, that's funny. But it really means to be at one with what I just learned, to really understand and embody the learning, to be in tune, to drink in. And so that's what we're trying to get at when we use experiential learning, is we're trying to actually create experiences people learn from that they can take with them. So I find when talking to people about this, that most people understand this. They understand, they go, yeah, there's nothing here that would surprise me. They understand the impact that kind of engagement has on development. And they often have some specific need that would benefit from deeper engagement, but they aren't really sure how to make it happen, especially at scale with the approaches that they're using. And so that's why I put the 4 things in here, because the more we can bring those 4 things into our own learning events, whatever shape and size they are, I think the more we can get at this kind of a deep engagement. So I'd love to ask and have people put in the Q&A. And actually, I'm going to do this so that I can see the Q&A. I would love to ask everybody this question. Whoops, sorry about that. I would love to ask the question, how have you ever seen this kind of engagement? How do you get at this kind of engagement when you are out there trying to engage folks? How do you get at this, or haven't you, or what are your thoughts? I'm going to open up the Q&A. There aren't any questions in there yet, but I would really love it if there were, or maybe comments. And if anybody wants to come off mic and say, hey, this is what I think of this, or this is what I've seen work, or this is what I've done, or I don't buy this, I would love to hear from anyone. And I can see it now, Beth, so I'm not completely blind. Working with children, learning about nature by being outside. That is really good. Thank you. Yes. When you are working, really great. And do you notice that when you do that, when you open up someone's world and you step outside, especially a child's, that their whole demeanor changes? That's just a shameless plug for getting kids outside. But yes, I agree. How do you learn about nature from inside a classroom, right? I don't know if anybody else remembers that, but I do remember being in grade school and doing these little trips to these woods that were right in back of our school just to pick up leaves or get a sample from the pond. So that's a great example. Who else has got an idea of an example of how they do this or how they've seen this done? Again, whether maybe you don't buy into it. Maybe you're thinking, nah, I don't think we need this kind of engagement to change behavior.
While we're waiting for others, Christine, I
Yeah.
can share when I've been doing some graduate school classes on technical communication, and whenever the instructor lets me not do the assigned project, but propose, like, I have a project for my job I'm trying to get done that looks like it ties to this material. Can I do that now or revise that in light of what we're doing here? It's it's really interesting. So I've taken for instance, I did kind of a narrative summary report on a task force, but turned it into a feasibility report,
Oh,
uh, and
interesting.
rewrote it with that lens and discovered all kinds of big gaps of information that I was missing to actually make a really good decision on what was next. So I would say that was an example for me anyway of how to do experiential learning.
Yeah, and I still really want to hear from people, and I'm going to make it awkward for all of you. I can't see your names, but I please feel some pressure to get on and tell us what you think about experiential learning and some good examples. It's always better to hear from people. Beth, I was in and you know the problem solving workshop that I do sometimes. I was in that recently, and we actually had a someone from outside come in, and this happened to be an in-person workshop, not a distance learning, but either way it would work. And came in and said, he couldn't get their attention. They were, 15 people in the room, all engrossed. He said, "What are they doing? I thought you were in training." I said, "We are in training." Right. That's what they're doing. And he couldn't believe it. They were producing things, they were discussing things, they were presenting things. And he said to him, it did look like no training they had ever been a part of. And that made me go, boy, we've come a long way. Just right. That we've learned how to do that, and that training overall has gotten better as people embrace taking that challenge on. It was quite something to it's quite something to see or hear. All right, we've got 21 people on. Any one person, tell us about how you get engagement, or maybe a time when you've been really engaged and uh, and looking back at it, you kind of think, I think it's because of, maybe it's one of the tips that we have here for you. I'm going to go back to this because I was anticipating with some of the comments that I would get. And if I'm not going to get them, I'm just going to assume them. So one of the things I get a lot when I talk about this is, how do I pull this off from an instructional design perspective? And there's no one answer to that, not at all. But the first thing it starts with is, rather than asking the question, what do I need to teach them? Instead, you ask the question, what do they need to do? Look at your learning objectives, and you know how we have a hard time sometimes getting our learning objectives to be outcome based. Well, it makes it a lot easier if somebody says, "Hey, I want to teach a project management class." The first thing I'll ask is, what do you want them to leave the class and be able to do? And if they say, well, for example, we need to be able to do risk assessments, well, then that's something we should do in the class. And so we need to be able to tee up the content that allows them to actually do a risk assessment. And we need to think that through. We need to craft the collaboration they're going to have with their peers. We need to craft the story around it. And it needs to be in the same kind of context that they're going to use it. And we want to make sure they actually do it. And so the change goes from creating slides to creating the elements that get engagement, which are the tasks that they'll need to do, the context they need to do them, perhaps some characters or someone they're going to interact with. Maybe it's just a biography written about a few people that we can hand out, and we understand who these people are a little bit, and we can get into the storyline. There's all different ways that you can do this, but the way you start is by changing the question you ask. You don't start with a list of topics. You start with a list of what do they have to go next. And I've noticed that uh, when I started designing this way and when I started facilitating this way, that my goal is always to have 10 to 15% of the time spent in lecture. And that's not really lecture, but just eyes at the front of the room or eyes on the main speaker and not in breakout rooms if you're doing it remotely. And the rest of the time, it is guided, it is facilitated experience. So it's not the facilitator taking their hands off, but the facilitator is not an instructor now as much as they are a guide and a facilitator. They're coaching, they're listening. It's not easy, but they're spending a considerable less amount of time telling people what to do and a more time shepherding through an experience that was so well designed in the beginning. They just know they need to facilitate them through the participants through the experience, and they're going to come out of it with the learning we want them to have. Um, and so that it changes the whole instructional design process to be more about what the participants need to learn and less about what the instructor feels like they need to tell. And one of the other questions, and I haven't gotten it, I'm pushing, I don't know. We haven't dropped a lot of people, so I feel like maybe they're still here, Beth, but just wanting, not really wanting to kind of chill and listen. So I think we've only lost one person so far, but that might change. So I would still encourage anybody to get on and join the conversation with me. It'll make it a better experience for everybody. Um, Thank you for saying you're here if other people jump in. But I'll tell you, since you haven't asked it yet, one of the questions I get is, how do facilitators, instructors make this leap? Like, how does someone who's a really good expert on a particular topic, and how do they make the leap to using an experience to teach? And that I love when I get that question because it all depends on how open the facilitator is and how comfortable they are in their expertise and not having to know everything. It's the instructors or the facilitators that think they know everything there is to know on a topic that get tripped up, because there's generally not a chance that they know more than every other person combined in the room. Or let me say it differently, they may know more specifically about that topic, but they don't have all of those combined experiences. So when an instructor, when it's easy for them to make the leap to facilitating this kind of experiential learning, um, they're the ones who, go ahead, Fatima, you've got your hand raised. I'll come back to my thought in a second. Beth, can you take Fatima off mute, or can she?
I just granted her permission to
I
talk.
am so sorry. I think it's a mistake. I hit the button. I'm so sorry.
Oh,
That's okay. That's
Oh,
okay. You don't have to feel like you
apologies
have
for
to
that.
speak.
Okay.
I've got another Q&A here. I've worked with new employees from other countries who do not have good computer skills, have them sit on the computer and help them enroll in their own benefits, no matter how long it takes. They always feel good when it's done. I like that analogy. Thank you for that. It's not about what you can tell them about how to do it, but sitting with them as they do and guiding them. I love that. That's a great contribution. Um, and I'll get
Christine,
back. Mhm.
you do have a response in the Q&A?
Oh, I do. I
Mhm.
have, that's the one I just read. I've worked with employees from other countries. That one?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was busy. I maybe goofed you up. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Please catch me if I, I appreciate it. Um, I think it's a great example that this person brings up. That is, it's a great example of being with someone, and think of the cycles of learning they're getting. They have a little bit of guidance from you, but they're doing it themselves, right? And then when they go and they leave the room and they go do it somewhere else, their self-efficacy just goes way up. And the self-efficacy they have if they go into another thing, that experience that they're having, they can bring to something else. Maybe it's a different kind of software that they're having to learn, because Lord knows we have a ton of those. So that's a really good example. I want to finish the thought on the leap for facilitators, and would love any comments about this. For some people, it's not much of a leap. For some that are really comfortable telling the same story at the same place in their slide deck, they always do. And it can be a little uncomfortable to start with. But once you flip it around to say, let's take your story that you have that you want to tell, and instead, let's take that experience that you had and embed it in an example and let them jump into it and play with it rather than you telling it. Let's pretend they got an email from somebody. Let's give them a situation that is your story, but you don't have to tell it. Let them dive into it. Let them own it. Let them be the center of it rather than you at the front of the room. And the facilitators that grasp that do really, really well. And in fact, the common point I get from facilitators that have sort of made this kind of leap, or that have tried to employ this idea of experience in some of their courses and then their training, is they are surprised at how much more in depth the questions are. Like, people will ask questions that are have a lot more insight and a lot more richness to them, because they're not asking those questions from up here in their head. They're asking them from a place of actually having to do. So the questions become more robust, and they become more the kinds of questions that people who go apply after a training come up with, rather than usually in training. So that is one of the topics a lot of people do ask me about, is how do I make that, if I want to do this, how do I start? And the answer is, you start from an instructional design perspective and making sure your learning objectives are actionable, and not asking about what you can teach. So don't start with your slide deck. Start with the experience. What's the story you could tell? What are many stories you could tell that you could immerse them in? And how will you do that? And how can you take them through that journey such that they and their colleagues learn? Then, of course, you check yourself at the end and you say, all right, now did we hit everything? It's very iterative when you design like this. You're looking at the experience that you're creating, and you're getting yourself in the mindset, and you're tweaking it constantly. And then you're always testing to say, do we think we're going to hit our learning objectives with this? Is the path to application clear? Is the context right? Is there enough collaboration? How are we debriefing when they do these things? How are we helping them on their journey? So the focus of instructional design and of authoring, if you will, changes a bit. But other than that, you can bring to bear all of your skills as a facilitator, except for maybe the lecture ones. You want to choose what you decide to say from the front of the room really wisely. I've even found that participants who are in especially if it's a longer type of a workshop rather than just a few in a one-off exercise or something, I find that when I interrupt them, because they're working probably in a team, maybe we have our participants divided into teams, which is generally the best way to do it because you get to that collaboration spot. But when I interrupt them, they get a little annoyed. They look at you like, what? Leave me alone. I want to do this. It's almost like you walked into their office and annoyed them that way. So it starts to feel really real. All right. So the only other
I'm
question.
just gonna
Go
hop in
ahead.
quick and say,
Yeah.
so as someone who leads a department rather than conducts training,
Yeah.
when I listen to you and what you're talking about today, and I think about what can I do as a department leader, I feel like one of the things my role would be is that if I'm going to have my staff take training or attend training, that what I want to first do then is say, don't look at the training topic. But as a leader, I'm thinking, what do I want them to do once they're done with training and be able to do once they're done with training? Or if I'm working with someone like you to facilitate a training session for my team, the way I can contribute to that training is by telling the instructional designer, these are the things that I
Yes.
come prepared to a meeting where I can articulate what skills I need my team to do. That's
Yeah.
my contribution as a department leader or a team leader to this situation.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Beth, and I think you're absolutely right. Plus, I'll add one. So the first thing is, if you are a team leader and you are wanting to your people to have experiences like this, and you're working with an instructional designer, just as you said, Beth, you want to start being very clear about what your expectations are about what they have to go and do next. Now, that, by the way, is good advice for any kind of training. It doesn't have to be experiential. That whole self-efficacy thing we talked about, even if someone were to go to a really poor training, in terms of it didn't engage them at all, if they knew what they had to do next, it would pique their interest. It would keep them on the bubble. It might be very stressful for them, as you saw in my Lean Six Sigma picture, but knowing what they have to go do next and having that clear with whoever has um, sponsored, if you will, their training is a really good point. And then another to go down that step, that path a little further, Beth, if you're someone who says, I want to do this for my team, I don't want to do something really big. I'm not talking about creating a whole training. I don't want to work with a curriculum designer. What can I do? Well, I bet you anything, all of you have some experience in your role that your new people or the people on your staff don't know about. And your tendency is probably to want to tell them about that experience, tell them a story about the worst customer service fiasco you ever encountered, for example, or perhaps a really awful safety incident, or perhaps a great success story about managing conflict, whatever it might be. Take your story and write it down and ask yourself, how could I make that sort of come to life? Is there any way that I could turn that into kind of a case study that allowed them to work through it rather than just hear from me? And in fact, when I design experiential learning, that's how I start. I take on topics I know nothing about and I talk to the people who do and ask them, what do you want your people to know? What do you wish all of them have lived through in order to be successful? And I will take notes and I will, with their permission, record what they're saying, and we'll start piecing together a storyline so that people can traverse through it. And it doesn't have to be really fancy. It's just a different way of doing things. All right. I have covered the points that I thought would come up from all of you. And I've covered the points that I would like you to think about. I would advise you to think about when you're thinking about experiential learning, about and maybe critiquing whether a training is good for your people. How much engagement are they going to get? Is it active? Will they have a chance to collaborate? Are they going to be immersed in a storyline so it feels real? And is the context that they're immersed in similar enough to what I need them to do when they come back? If that kind of becomes your shopping list, and if you do, as Beth said, to start with being real clear with your people, I think you are in a good place. So I would love to just open it up to anybody. Offer it one more time, questions or comments or concerns from anyone, because I'm certainly not going to keep you here just to hear myself talk. And Beth, I'd welcome to you if you think if I've missed anything that you and I had kind of talked about.
No, I would just say I liked what you just said there about these four pieces being your shopping list. So if as a leader, if you don't want to, have take on doing the training for your team and you're going to go look for somebody else, that these four things, that when you go look at the training that's available out there, whether it's virtual, asynchronous, independent study, LinkedIn learning, that you're looking to see that these four elements are present if you really want to get, I guess, if you want to spend your training dollars wisely. And if you don't see these right off the bat, to ask questions of the training provider to make sure that you're hitting these four pieces.
And I'll add to that, Beth, that there are times where when you're just trying to get at, um, you know, glimpsing or a little retention or the ability to spit back some knowledge, you don't have to go as deep, right? But if you really want them to do things differently, they don't need to just merely glimpse it or grasp it. They really need to be prepared to do that path to application. Then this becomes even more important, even more important. So, all right. Any final questions or comments from all of you online? Looks like we've lost a few people. I'm wrapping up here, so I understand that. For someone who's not comfortable in lecture, as I've been telling you, this is a little uncomfortable for me, but I hope you found this worthwhile, and that you can walk away with a little bit, if not the same, maybe a little confirmation, or maybe a little bit different thought on what helps people be really engaged and how that leads to deeper learning. And Beth, I don't think I have anything else. I'll hold on with you and stay here in case anybody wants to follow up or ask questions. And I think you have some parting words as well.
Yeah, I will, I think just continue your sharing and
Yes.
share my screen. So I will just let people know that April's Expert Insights coming up is on accelerating change, tips for keeping change moving. And this is for leaders or as a coworker, or I don't know, maybe it applies to your family, whatever. Change is, I feel like we can never get enough information on how to do change and do change better. And so that's coming up. It does come with a survey. So if you subscribe to our newsletter, we will be having a link that you can go and take a survey to tell us a little bit about change in your own organizations. We're really interested in what's happened since the pandemic. So look for that change link to come out in our newsletter, and then look to sign up for next month's change. And Christine, I can't see the Q&A. Any final Q&As from you?
There was one person who chimed in, said, so I looked up the word grok. Very interesting. It means understanding something or by empathy. And it's my new favorite word. The best example I can think of is I can say something like, now that I grok you, I understand your humor. In other words, now that I really know you, I kind of get what your humor is, right? But anyway, it's a fun word. It means exactly, if you look it up, it's exactly what I'm talking about here, that deep level of understanding. So thanks to the participant who took the time to look it up.
All right, and thank you to the people for attending today. And with that, we will wrap things up and say, hope you join us again next month for the Expert Insights on Change.